What is going on, Hot Take Nation? DRW here with a follow-up episode. I think this is the first time we've had a guest twice, and I think he's gonna be like a fixture on the show. It was about 30 days. Mark Rossano, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Thanks for having me. Good. How are you?
Great. So a lot of change for you in the last 30 days. But for the listeners who didn't listen to that first episode, I said, if you would like to be scared, I encourage talking to Mark, because on a lot of the supply side issues, I was on Fast Money, I think that week. Mark and I were just talking about that off camera. And I had said that 20 million barrels a day was the demand destruction. And like, as soon as I said it, like the rest of the market jumped up to 20. And then Mark very quickly after was like, I actually think it's more like 30. And immediately the entire market moved to 30. So I think if we say on the show, it's going to be like 40 million barrels of destruction, I think that'll just be the new number.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and it's funny because, we were trying to look forward and trying to say like, look, 38 million is going to be when India shuts down, when Europe continues to shut down, Russia has now shut down. So as the extensions keep coming and things get worse and worse, I mean, there's no reason why we can't peak at 50. I mean, but 50 is a lot though. Let's be fair.
I mean, but honestly, like when you and I were talking, and I remember, I very vividly remember this because you and I had talked about it in sort of like the first week of March. We were texting back and forth. We talked about ventilators and the flatten the curve. Yep. And that really it was about like, we were going to still have the same number of patients, but we were trying to spread it out so people would have access to ventilators. Right. And then the Imperial College model came out. That's been debunked as too aggressive. There's now this new model out of the University of Washington. I saw a stat today that sort of said like April 2nd, it predicted we needed 250,000 beds. Then it was 200,000. Then it was 100,000. Then it was 80,000. And now I think it's 58,000. You're in the center of the action in New York.
Yep.
We just had the governor come out and extend the stay at home until May 15th. Walk us through what's going on in New York these days.
It's really a tale of two cities, and you have to think about upstate, downstate. So upstate is only counting for about 6% of New York's cases, which it just means that everything is being centralized and focused in the Westchester, New York City, Long Island area. And the pain is just being felt across the board. They've been trying to aggressively adjust in order to care for these people in terms of turning recovery rooms into ICUs, turning step-down areas into putting up false walls, creating more rooms, just to handle the influx of people that require care. And the interesting thing is the care that's being received are people that are between the ages of 30 and 50. And, you hear about, oh, it's only the old. It's like, well, it's maybe only the old that are dying, but it's still the 30 to 50-year-olds that are getting sick and require care. So go ahead.
No. So, I mean, like, how does it feel like, at least from, I'm in Arizona, obviously closely connected with Texas and Colorado, only temporarily in Arizona because golf is an essential service, very important. But it feels to me like the mandate has changed from flatten the curve, fill up the hospital beds across the country so everyone has access. Now it feels like don't let anybody get sick. Does it feel like that mandate has changed to you?
Well, it's a matter of getting people out of the hospital now, because if you look at like North Shore University Hospital, it's a hospital that has 19 floors that are dedicated to COVID-19. That's a hospital that went from having 1 floor to 6 floors to 10 floors to the full hospital being converted straight to COVID, and kicking people out of the physical therapy region, putting more non-COVID patients in there, and then shifting people once they give birth to the ambulatory center to get them out of the hospital. Like, and think of it this way: like you're about to give birth, you get dropped off at the curb. You're brought into the hospital, you give birth, they let you and the baby sit around for 2 hours, make sure you're stable. They then throw you in an ambulance to take you 2 miles up the hill and just to get you out of the hospital. Like, you can't function normally with that kind of scenario. You need to have the ability to take, heart attack, strokes, have normal surgery, have normal operations. So until you get to that point, it's going to be, well, how do we protect people? Because we can't risk it, because there's no beds, there's no availability. The ORs are quiet, but the floors are jam-packed. So it's a matter of shifting that curve. So we flattened the curve. Now it's a matter of getting people out of the hospital. And the problem is the average stay of a person is about 12 days.
Yeah, I did see that. The stay seems very long.
Yeah, I mean, my wife has had has had 3 C-sections, and they kick you out of the hospital after 3 days, and you just had your stomach ripped open. I mean, this is something where you don't appreciate the kind of drain on resources that you're getting by having someone in the hospital for 12 whole days.
Right. I mean, I can't even imagine the hospital bills per person. Like, no one is talking about the cost. Yep. But there's 30 million uninsured Americans. Yep. There's now 20 million people who've lost their jobs. Some may have had healthcare, some maybe not. But the insurance that even if they carry, if you're having all these people have $400,000 hospital bills, I mean, the cost is just astronomical. I would think.
Oh, yeah. And then you think about it. With my middle daughter, she had to have massive heart surgery at the third day of life. And we were in the hospital for 2 months, and we were in the ICU for, the PICU for about, I think it was a total of 5 weeks before we went to step down. And each day in ICU care was $12,000. And that's just the room. That's not the medicine. That's not the ventilator. That's just the room and the nurse. That was what that cost. And if you think about a normal hospital bed, that's $2,500 to $3,000 a day. And that's just the room. That's not the medicine, the care. That's just the room itself. And you have to think about, how is that going to work? And some of the social workers have been working overtime because you're allowed a 30-day allotment of Medicare, Medicaid. So you have some people that will fall under that rule and will be able to get care or coverage for those 30 days. But if you need follow-up after that 30-day expires, I mean, good luck. That's going to be all out of pocket.
So there hasn't been a lot of talk. I mean, obviously the media is pretty New York centric. I mean, rightfully so. It's the hotspot. It's also the center of commerce in the U.S. Huge population space. There isn't a lot of talk about population density and the solution that's been implemented in New York, where population density is like 28,000 per square mile. LA is like 8,000 a square mile. And so California, who's still under a shutdown and they have less than 1,000 deaths, and shut down at about the same time as New York, 2 days earlier. The Californians would like to take credit for how that government policy really saved everything. But I'm like, it was 2 days.
Right.
New York is 3.5 times more dense. And everyone from Europe and China and everyone goes to New York because they don't go to California. So it kind of stands to reason. But do you think this one size approach fits all, shutting down the West Coast, not opening any parts of the economy? Like, what do you think on that view?
Well, so when you think about density, like you said, New York City's number 1, San Francisco's number 2 in the country. But you have to think about, how do people travel? When you're in New York, you're traveling on a subway, you're traveling in underground or on some sort of train where you're on top of one another. And if you think about the nature of COVID-19, it lives fairly well on plastic and metal. And what are people touching? What are people holding? You think about it, like somebody holds a pole, you get on 30 seconds later, put your hand in the same place, then you scratch your eye, you pick your nose, you do something, and all of a sudden you're now infected. And you get this proximity where it's not only the closeness in which people live, it's also how do they travel. And if you think about California, most people are taking their own cars. They're taking something that isn't public transportation. So even if you have a density, you're not really on top of each other in the same way. So you have that separation that you don't have in New York. Yeah.
So, I mean, what do you think about the fact that all the states are doing, because I mean, and we're going to transition to the economy, and then we're going to transition to QE, because I think that you have such a great understanding on what the Fed has done in the last month. And a lot of listeners will benefit from that. And then we'll close with your podcast and what you've been talking about in terms of supply and primary vision and frac counts and all of that great stuff. But as you look at the economy, I mean, do you think that it makes sense for some of these less dense places like Texas, places like California, where you take your own car, versus the total shutdown we have in New York? Are we using the right approach for this virus at this point, 45 days in?
I think it's more precaution, and if you think about is there the density of hospitals, where's the density of beds? The New York has a huge chunk of those beds, where some of these places that could get overrun fairly quickly, it was important to stop it early. And then the question is, like, if you have New York and then you travel out and then all of a sudden you get the spread, you have people who are asymptomatic. So the goal was to try to shut things down as quickly as possible, limit the contagion, and really kind of nip this in the bud and leave it on the coasts to protect that coastland, the interior of the U.S., and leave it more on the coast. The problem now is, as we start looking towards planting season and we start looking towards, how are we going to normalize, how many migrant workers come to the heartland to help in the planting of seeds, chemicals, go running the tractors, tilling the land, like these little things that are going to start coming into focus as we're into April. And we really need to get seeds in the ground by the middle of May to ensure we have the yield that we expect. So as we start looking at this, you want to start opening from the interior out, and you want to make sure it's like, okay, let's start in the interior where we have lower population growth, lower population density. You don't take buses and trains the same way, and start slowly working its way back out, because you really don't want to have New York open first, California open first, and asymptomatic people flying into these regions. You want to go center back to the coast. And then that's how I think you can really fix this. The question is wave 2.
Yeah,
because
I was going to say.
Yeah. So what happens with wave 2? You've had Japan shut down with 7 states of emergency. You have Singapore on a 30-day lockdown. You have India extending, and you have South Korea talking about reinfections and a potential resurgence. And the question is, well, how do you stop that? And I really think you have to limit international travel. You really need to make sure that travel is impacted, and to the point where you're only traveling if you have to, and you have testing the moment you come in. Like, you can't come in unless you've been tested. We know that you're not asymptomatic, and then you can come home, live in your house for a 14-day quarantine, and go about your day. But I mean, in my opinion, it's interior to exterior to really keep it, because that's where I think you're going to get the last really bad surge will remain on the coast at this point, specifically in the tri-state area.
So, I mean, if we think about that, I mean, basically shutting down international travel, and I mean, the whole point, and this is where I've always struggled too, is like, if you're asymptomatic and so many people are asymptomatic, it only takes one person from any country to start it up again. So let's assume we're going to have a second wave. We are not going to have herd immunity. We're not going to have a vaccine. There isn't really a way out unless you just massively restrict freedoms. And every day that goes by where you're restricting what I'm going to call freedoms, you're actually restricting the economy. Like, they say that this is like, what do we call this? Social distancing. Mm-hmm. We're all locked in our homes, and like, commerce is not really happening.
Yeah. Well, and you have to think about also in terms of social distancing, how are people going to think about this on their own right? Now that we've experienced this, and what you said about possible reinfection, are you really going to go to a crowded bar, a crowded restaurant, to some concert? The way you consume is going to be impacted until we have a meaningful way of treating this. Either, say for an example, you get sick and you go and you get swabbed for the flu, you get swabbed for COVID. They give you Tamiflu for the flu, or they give you the Tamiflu equivalent for COVID, and you go home, you're sick for 5 days, and then you're up and running within 14. The problem is you have to treat it so severely because of the drain on hospital resources.
Right. Which is just so crazy to think about, because I do think you're going to see, as we talk about the economy, you're going to see this wave, because look, rightfully or wrongfully, I kind of feel like whoever's going to get sick is going to get sick, and that the vaccine is so far away. Some people will stay home. My wife and I have talked about it with the kid. Like, as soon as there's a restaurant and a store and a mall open, we're probably going.
Right.
And so the interesting, and that to your point then, is you have all the people who are stay at home or social distancing and want to have some level of life. And then you have a whole bunch of other people, like the Florida kids on spring break, were like, I'll be fine. They go. And so you're going to have these two classes where like one class is like, I won't go to a store unless everyone's wearing a mask. And then there's some people who's like, I am never going to wear a mask. And then there's people who are like, I want to get vaccinated because I always get vaccinated. And then there's people who are like, I've never been vaccinated. I never go to the hospital. I'll take my chances. You're going to see this massive bifurcation of society go forward. And so what do you think that does for the economy? And how do you feel about the stimulus plan that's been put forth since we last chatted?
So the first to touch on the mask side of the equation. I mean, if you think about on a cultural level, in Asia, it's normal. Like the moment you get sick in Asia, you put on a mask because it's out of courtesy to those around you. And that's really not part of our culture, but it's something that needs to be adopted over the next, let's call it 18 to 24 months until we have a virus, because that's the only surefire way to really limit the contagion. The problem is, which I think there's some good points have been made on making people wear masks. You don't want people to think like, oh, I'm wearing a mask, I'm fine, I can go anywhere. And then you get careless. So you want to have that combination of, hey, how about you wear a mask, but you have to be intelligent about it and think about how you're wearing it. Like you know, I go to the store and people are wearing a mask, but it's beneath their nose. It's like, buddy, you're not doing anybody any service by keeping it beneath. Like it's meant to be your whole face.
Right.
So to have it just half on, half off, I get it. It's not a crowded store. Like there is limited risk, but you have to protect yourself and you have to protect others because there will be people that are immune suppressant that don't have the same type of response, and you need to care for everybody on that level. So I think the mask is key because, you know, you can't make people get vaccinated. You probably, you know, it'd be nice if you could, but you can't. And to your point, until you can really vaccinate, it's hard to really open everything up freely and kind of shop and move about with comfort. You know, and again, like you may go to the mall, but if the mall is packed, are you going to walk in?
Yeah, I mean, and those are that is the question, which then leads to like the choices and I mean, it's such a complicated issue. And I do find I'm not going to say it's ironic because it's not, but the US has been successful as a nation because of the me first Ayn Rand virtue of selfishness. Like I'm going to drive my self-interest, my benefits, my economic gain. We're not going to have Medicare for all. We're not going to socialize education. We're not going to we're going to do me first.
Right.
And our entire culture is built around me first. And now there's this sort of shaming that's like, we want it to be you first, but we need you to wear a mask, but not for you, for us. But we don't want to have Medicare for all. And we definitely don't want to socialize education.
Right.
It's an interesting juxtaposition for us to be in.
Right. And like when you think of Ayn Rand, you know, the one thing that I always appreciated with the view was it's me first, but it's me first with a view of acting in the best interest of me and my company. Like I want to be selfish and make money for my company, but I'm not going to do that by screwing my partners, you know, going against my employees and going against my customers. I'm going to do things that are right for all. So if it comes down to protecting your employees because you want to make money, you want your business to operate, you're going to be like, hey guys, like wear this mask because if you don't, we're going to have to shut down. And if we shut down, 300 people are getting furloughed and we're going to have to disinfect.
And that's where I wish the government was being, I guess, more like, you know, one of the things I talked to another guest on a previous show about was oil and gas people by their nature probably have the most data intensive industry, maybe other than the finance community, but like you have thousands of terabytes of data on drilling and wells and production and performance and supply and demand. And at $60,000 a day, or on the Gulf of Mexico, like $250,000 a day, you're getting a call at 2 a.m. You're getting 3 minutes of information and you're having to make a call right then. Right. And so I watch these politicians kind of like give 45-minute updates that they don't say anything. And they're not saying, okay, look, here's the deal. We're going to reopen. We're going to reopen restaurants. We're going to do these things. And the trade-off is you're going to wear a mask. That's just the way it's going to be. This is how it's going to work. Here's the plan. We're going to go for a month and see where it goes. Right. It feels like we're all just like, well, we're social distancing while everyone's trapped at home. And I'm really sorry if you were a small business. We've chosen Amazon to win, who's hitting all-time highs, by the way. Yeah. Your business is screwed. I'm really sorry for you. And there's nothing you can do. You can't open You can't wear a mask. Just stay home, and I'm sorry about your impending bankruptcy.
Well, and then you look at like Target, like can Target really sell televisions even though Best Buy is closed? And is it fair that Best Buy is closed and, you have Amazon selling televisions, and that's where it comes down to, look, if you're going to focus on the essentials, that's all you can sell. The essentials are this, this is what we know them to be. Let's focus on that. Make sure that the supply chains are safe because, realistically, do you want to worry about getting your television from point A to point B, or do you want to utilize that truck driver to make sure that you can get, apples, vegetables, things to market
right
in a way, because we've drained everything so aggressively in this hoarding frenzy that we really need to backfill. And that's another problem in terms of, food security, which is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Like back to the in South Dakota, shutting down the chicken facility, you have to think about, well, what happens when you have to shut down a meat processing center? One, they're kept cold because, they want to make sure that the meat stays fresh. And at the same time, everything's stainless steel. That's legitimately the perfect environment for COVID to survive.
Right.
So you have to think about, well, how do you treat this? Like, you have to be very specific about, well, where are we going to focus our efforts? And if you think about restaurants, restaurants want to maximize occupancy. Well, in order to reopen, let's start by cutting your occupancy in half, increasing the distance in which you're operating. But then at the same time, it's like, do you make the waiters and waitresses wear gloves? Because, you're touching everybody's stuff. And if you're infected, you're picking up how many wine glasses to fill, you're picking up how many water glasses to fill, and you've spread how much to how many different people.
But so doesn't it seem like I was thinking about that. So my waiter or waitress comes with my glass wearing gloves, but like the virus presumably stays on, because if I transfer it to the glass, yes. I just transfer it to their glove.
Correct.
Then transfers it to someone else. So it's, and then again, if I'm trying to build herd immunity and get people sick at a reasonable pace, so that the hospitals can manage it, like, do I not want some people getting? So it raises so many complicated questions, which is not what politicians are able to do.
No, absolutely. And then you think about it, like, does that mean that the waiter walks around with a Purell and they touch your stuff and then they Purell, then they touch someone else's stuff and they Purell? And all of a sudden you're like, well, this is just ridiculous. Like, what are we actually doing right now?
Right.
And that's the difficulty. And realistically, until, like, just using New York for an example, do you wait for, just using North Shore as an example, like, do you wait from going from 19, 18 floors to 4, where you have 4 COVID, which means that it's manageable, things are starting to normalize, and now you can start getting to a level of normalcy and start reopening at a faster clip? Or do you say, okay, guys, like, the building is going to reopen. We're going to have to make sure that we're 20 feet apart. We're going to increase the cleanliness, and, we're going to do it in waves of the 25% come into the office for a month, see how it goes. You 20, then you move it to 35%, then 50%, and then you stay at 50% occupancy in a floor, because one of the worst decisions that's ever been created, and I think whoever came up with it should have a special place in hell, is the open floor concept of working, because it's terrible, it's distracting, it should never happen, and in this particular environment is the worst thing you could have, where some guy coughing or blowing a nose or doing something and then infecting 10 people around them instead of just being in an office.
How about, we work in Uber as business models. Like, Uber is like using someone else's car that someone else has been in that probably isn't clean, and you're doing it at a discount. So that's a thing. Yeah. But then WeWork is like, we want you out of the house to come to hang out in a group of people with a whole bunch of common spaces and packed in as tightly as humanly possible, so that you can video conference with people in other countries. I mean, there's
amazing.
It's literally, in hindsight, knowing what we know today, it's literally the worst business ever founded. And it had a $47 billion valuation 6 months ago.
And that's why, like, when you start looking at the foolishness of where we sit, And that can lead into, what the Fed has done and where stimulus is when you look at the evaluations of these things. But it leads to so many questions. Like, it really has to be a rolling start in terms of reopening, because you can't do it all at once, because then if you do, you already have hospitals that are at max capacity. They're not breaking, which is good. I mean, that's always been the goal, is don't break the system. But if you do it too fast, then it's like, now we're overwhelmed. So you have to do it in that rolling stance in terms of, let's start in the middle, slowly work our way out. Unfortunately, I think the better answer is going to be, you keep schools shut for the rest of the year. Because if you think about who's transmitting, who is not getting sick, like who's getting sick, but not to the point where it's like, they might have something. It's the kids. Kids are getting sick, and it's coming out as a bad cold, mild flu. But when it goes to grandma or it goes to your older aunts and uncles, it's not just a bad cold or a mild flu. It's COVID-19 at its worst form.
So let's talk about that, because I think that the big thing is this Fed fiscal stimulus, and QE. But let's start with QE, because QE came first. And you and I were writing, I think it was after the show even, and we were just like, they are buying municipal bonds. They're buying. Talk to the listeners about what the Fed did before we even talk about the 2.3 trillion and what has to happen next.
So at this point, they essentially went out and said that banks are insolvent. There's not enough collateral on the sheets to make sure that they can do business as they need to, in terms of the way their collateral is held and what kind of exposure their clients have. So the first thing was immediately print to get a repo, which is just if a bank is short capital, instead of going to borrow it from another bank, you go and you borrow it from the Fed. So the first thing they did was immediately increase the repo rate, exponentially, not the rate itself, just the amount of capital available. So they took it and they said, look, we're going to have, I think it was at one point, 750 billion available at any given time through overnight, 14-day, and then 30-day. So once that was deployed, the market laughed at it and said, yeah, we've seen this. Like, we're still not there yet.
Does the money come back? Like, so that the Fed, the way you describe it is it's a 30-day loan. They raise the balance sheet, presumably, because you and I were texting that morning, and you're like, I mean, someone big is in major trouble.
Yeah, someone's insolvent.
It's like a massive bank is like basically screwed. But then the liquid, and I remember I've talked to multiple people about the March 23rd lows, and like the bond traders who traded in 87 and in 2008 had never seen such insolvency. Like that there were no bids for anything. And like when we look back on this 2 years from now, it was like the financial system was like almost completely done.
Right.
But so does the Fed then, now that people have got a little liquidity and normalcy, are they now giving the money back to the Feds and lightening the balance sheet?
No, they've actually gone the opposite, and they've actually made it worse, which is why the whole thing is funny. So in a repo, you're right. Like in a repo, it's overnight. You're posting collateral, you're taking overnight, you're paying an overnight rate, and then you're giving it back. And it's just a matter of making sure you have that overnight capital. Overnight capital turned into 14-day, which meant that you would get a loan for 14 days, which was better because it meant that there was more capital in your sheets. You didn't have to worry about the overnight. And then they offered the 30-day, which was something even better at very low rates. Now the Fed decided to just buy outright. So if you're a bank and you can either borrow or sell, or would you borrow or would you just sell?
You'd sell your shittiest exposure.
Exactly. You would just say, oh, you want to buy this? Yeah, here you go. Oh, you want to buy that too? Oh, here you go. And they just start unloading their balance sheet, that's stuck with, high yield debt, which is now something that the Fed is buying at a pace of, I think they capped it at 750 billion. And it's for someone who has recently gone into high yield. So if you were investment grade before, I think the cutoff was March 20th, and you became high yield between March 20th and now, your bond is eligible to be sold and be bought by the Fed and get off the sheets. And you're looking at this, it's like, okay, well, this is a slippery slope. When do they turn around and say, well, March 20th is a little light. This really started to get bad in January. So we're going to say January. It's like, all right, well, we need an extra zero. So 750 billion becomes 7.5 trillion because why not? Where there's so many zeros at this point, you could just add another one. And you're just getting this massive expansion of the balance sheet in terms of just outright purchases as well as, the repo. But everyone's looking at this and saying to me, oh, look, the repo usage is going down. It's like, obviously, if I have to borrow money and then pay it back with interest, or I just sell it to you outright, owe you no interest, and unload something off my balance sheet and take in cash, why wouldn't I do that 10 out of 10 times?
Yeah.
And that's what you're seeing.
So I mean, and all this ties back to the cost, but so the Fed is now buying things. And if you think about business models changing and the model you just described, like people are going to still use the subway question mark because there's metal and plastic and vaccinated, not. New Yorkers go back or don't go back. We go to restaurants that at 50% capacity have to charge double for food. You get on an airline that every time I get on an airline, it feels like my knees are closer to my throat. And I'm pretty sure I'm getting fatter, but not like taller. And so I don't understand why the person in front of me is like literally like on my chin.
Right.
But now airlines are going to have to fly half, which means prices are going to double. Hotels, cleaning changes, supermarkets change. And yet the high yield bonds, like if you're buying a high yield bond of an airplane or an airline or Boeing, who buys airplanes after this if half your fleet isn't being used?
And that's where I think they're going to have to, it's going to be a mixture of, do they focus on utilization or are they forced to focus on social distancing? Because if take a cruise ship for an example, let's just say Carnival has 50 cruise ships. Are you going to operate all 50 at a 30% capacity, or are you going to operate 20 at 75, 80% capacity? And the answer is always going to be, I'm going to operate 20 at maximum capacity. So the question is, do you get forced to space that out? Or do you get forced to say, okay, you can do your 85, but I need to see how you're cleaning everything on the hour, every hour, to make sure that things are safe? First off, I don't know who would ever take a cruise at this point, but everybody's different.
Right. In fairness, you're like 80. You're gonna die of something pretty soon. So you're like, cruise seems great.
It's an interesting time. And then to your point about flying, at what point do you feel comfortable that do you just leave the middle seat and have everyone wear a mask, and then you could have a higher occupancy, and you can try to maximize your fleet to the best of your ability? The problem is you have people that are just going to avoid flying, because as we're doing this on Zoom, does this become more of the normal where people are like, hey, this Zoom isn't so bad, or this new product isn't so bad. Like, we're still getting what we need to done. Do I really need to see you face to face? And then business practices start to change and starts to lessen the load. But at the same time, to your point on Delta or United, do I really need those planes anymore? Or do I need that capacity? Right.
And so then I think about Boeing, I think about commercial real estate. And I know Carl Icahn has taken a huge short position for a lot of reasons, but like the entire business model of airlines, hotels, and commercial real estate is to load as much debt as humanly possible on a property, massively maximize occupancy, and lengthen the term of that loan. And now if people, and oil and gas companies have used that too, and energy demand is going down. So like the scenario you're talking about is like a materially different life.
Yeah.
All the businesses in the S&P today are built for the old way. Mm-hmm. The market's been rallying. There's been QE. There's this fiscal. People's rents that they're not paying, it's going to come due. You're going to get evicted. Like, how do you play this out in the next 3 months? And why is the market above 2,000 in the S&P?
So, when you get capital, the thing is you have to put it somewhere. So then the question is, where do you put it? And the answer has been, you put it in tech, because tech doesn't have a supply demand. What is an algorithm really worth? An algorithm can be worth whatever you think it should be worth, because, I think it's going to be worth X, Y, and Z, where a bank has book to value, an energy company has oil in the ground. I can easily tell you what is that oil worth in the current market. There are things like, chemicals, refiners. Exactly. Yeah, you have chemicals, you have refiners, you have things that have a clear physical, I can touch it, I can feel it, I can measure it, I can weigh it, where tech continues to outperform just because that's where it's easier to put money. Not that it's right or wrong, it's just where things are going. And if you look at how tech is weighted in the S&P, the way tech is weighted in essentially the market overall, you get this outperformance. And at the same time, you get the inflation trade where it's like, okay, well, if the Fed's trying to reinflate, I'm going to try to get ahead of that. But, at some point you have a thing called law of diminishing returns, where if you think about 07, 08, 09, where we had this $4 trillion pumped into the market, we did that in 15 days. And we're still going up, because when you think about, okay, well, the Fed balance sheet's currently at 7 trillion. That doesn't include the fiscal stimulus of 3.4 trillion on its way to 4.4 trillion.
And when you say 3.4, the number I see is 2.3. So where's the extra 1.1 trill?
The extra is what Pelosi and the House is currently.
Okay. Because we're only getting through April with people's stimulus checks. The small business, the 356 billion is already tapped out fully.
Yep.
And so they got to pull another trillion out of somewhere.
Right, which is clear. So I mean, to me, it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when it gets passed. So to me, that's 3.4 trillion. That's absolutely going to be in the market. So now you have this scenario of, okay, well, that's a lot of dollars getting pushed into the market, but who is it going to? Like, where is it going? And if you look at credit card statements, I think JP Morgan had a really good chart on terms of how, spending has changed, and where you've seen obviously a spike in food stores, but, movies, entertainment, restaurants, just spending has shifted. And the problem is the furloughs. If you think about a company that has now furloughed 100 people, are you really going to hire back 100 people once the economy starts to open? No, you're going to do it at levels of, let's just say, like the way I've described it is increments of 10. So you're going to hire back 10, see how it goes, give it a month, make sure things are going well, hire back another 10, see how it goes. Has demand picked up? Can you carry another 10? And all of a sudden, we're in September, and you've hired back 20 of your 100. So, and then things start to pick up, things start to normalize a bit. We haven't had to shut down again because, wave 2 didn't really materialize. Hospitals are normalizing, things are starting to get better. And then by December, you've hired back 40. Well, do you need the other 60? What is now your full employment? As you said, things aren't really going back to normal. They're not going to get back to where we were for the next, in my opinion, for the next 2 to 3 years. So you don't need that additional 40. So you're going to get this shift in employment. And then to your point on hospitality, hospitality, some of these places were struggling already. And you have people that were, Hilton, Marriott, Intercontinental, that had some facilities that were at the best of times. Let's use last year as an example. Some of these facilities were at 60, 65% occupancy. They were already on the cusp of, do I get rid of it? And now this is just a reason of, let's just keep that closed. Yeah. So how many workers were there? Like, how many people were in that facility that are just not going to come back for the foreseeable future? So you're going to get this stickiness in terms of unemployment. And these are people that have high credit card debts. They have high mortgages. There's people who have 17 mortgages and they own 17 Airbnb homes. Are you going to an Airbnb at this point? If you can go to a hotel that can guarantee, I've cleaned this room, this many times with this amount of, or are you going to trust an Airbnb? So it's going to have this weird give and take, because don't get me wrong, I have friends in Airbnbs right now. They're saving graces in terms of getting out of the city. But when you go back to normal, a more normalized business, are you going to trust someone, a stagnant house or a hotel room? And I don't know the answer. I know, and those are the debates. Again, media does 2-minute clips, as you and I both know from being on television. Is like you prepare all this stuff, and you could literally talk for hours about a topic, and then they're like, tell us the 30 seconds as to what that means, and then you're done, and you're like, but
like when you look at Amazon trading at all-time highs, the tech, everyone's moving money clearly, like into Tesla. They furloughed half their staff. No one is going to be buying a Tesla. And yet they're back to where they were when the short squeeze was, or when they were dropping like to the floor. Amazon's at an all-time high, but the people, you have to have income to buy goods of any kind on Amazon.
Yeah.
So Amazon is winning at the expense of Best Buy and all of the other places. And so it might be the only company left, but then there's no employment and nobody buys it. So again, inflation trade aside, don't fight the Fed aside, does it feel like the S&P should be trading at 2,800 right now?
No. And that's why I think you're going to get a rude awakening in tech. And if you look at, I think Schwab put out a stat where they opened the most accounts ever. And you look at Robinhood, you look at Schwab, and people are going to buy what they know, and buying, retail has been the big buyer of tech at this point. And do you really trust retail? Like you look at Amazon, for an example, you only get charged if once they ship it. So the question is, if they can't get it, can they actually charge you for it? As the supply chain continues to dwindle, you have inventories falling, and things go on hiatus. At the same time, you also have AWS. AWS is a huge moneymaker for them and helps them carry a lot of these lost leaders that they have. How many small startups are going to go away because of this and don't need server space, don't need the same type of resources? So all of a sudden, AWS starts to get impacted. And then you have people that are maybe, I don't need as much capacity on my web page that I host on AWS. I only need a little bit less because I want to save capital as much as I can. As the gig economy starts to struggle, do I need those same platforms, or do the platforms consolidate? So I think that there's going to be some pain that isn't really appreciated in some of these stocks, because when you think of Amazon, like what you're saying, like I see the Amazon truck, I see that Amazon truck dropping off a ton of packages. Well, how much money did they make doing that? And we all know it, they're making peanuts because that's a lost leader for them. But AWS is a huge component for them. When does that really start to impact their company? And then when Whole Foods, obviously all of these guys had these massive surges and are going to have some great earnings, but you still have to backfill. What is that supply chain going to cost? And to your point about people who have seen inflation or are concerned about the future, am I really going to buy chicken for $9 a pound when, only 2 weeks ago it was $4? No, I'm going to buy something a little bit different. And if you think about the way, supermarkets are created, they make all their money on the outside. If you do the loop, how many people can't afford steak anymore, so they go to pork. And then maybe they can't afford steak or pork, so they go down to chicken. And then you start to kind of see the dwindling, and you get the surge and then this pullback in terms of earnings. So I think that the tech sector is an interesting one in terms of hiding, like Tesla, for an example. Like it's everybody wants to own it. It's the future, but can they really achieve it? People just lost their jobs. They're concerned about how they're going to, feed their family. They're going to go out and buy a Tesla when gasoline is free. Yeah. I mean, gasoline is 60 cents at the rack. Tesla's going to compete. I just struggle with the whole concept in terms of Tesla is going to struggle for the foreseeable future, just because you're going to have gasoline prices so low for so long, just given the amount of gasoline in storage and how travel's changed. One thing to touch on before I finish this rant.
I love the rants. This is why once a month you're coming on. We're going to call it the Rossano rant. Special segment.
Well, when you look at China, for an example, they were the first. So if you think about China, they can only game the data so much. So let's take TomTom for an example. TomTom data shows traffic normalizing for the most part Monday to Friday. Monday to Friday, you have traffic either at 100% of where it was or 85 to 90% of where it was. Saturday and Sunday is 80% off of normal. So that's essentially telling you, look, people will go to work. People will go to work Monday to Friday. They will do what they need to do. They're not going out on the weekends. They're not going to do and spend the way they have in the past, not only because they don't have the capital, because they just burn through their savings or what they were going to use to go to the movies or buy a television or go on vacation to feed their family. And if you're furloughed, you're like, all right, well, I could go back. I might go back. I might not. Until I have confidence, I'm going to just sit and be idle for the moment. And that's why even if you get this normalization, the weekends, I think, are telling you, like, look, gasoline's going to be well below average. We will not get driving season the way we have ever. I mean, this is going to be a shakeup to driving season. So that's a long way of saying that Tesla is going to be facing a very competitive market as gasoline prices remain so low.
So do you have what does the S&P touch? I mean, I think Elliott Management was out this morning saying they think it could come down 50% from the highs, which would be sort of a 1,700 kind of handle.
Yep.
What do you think comes in the next, let's say, before we open mostly in July, it looks like? How are you feeling?
So the last time we spoke, I said my low was 1,600 as the stretch, and I thought we could get to 2,300. I think it was off by about 50 handles, and then we bounced a bit. We got into about 2,200. We bounced around there. Now we're coming back. I tend to agree with them, and I agree with them not so much in the time frame, because I think the time frame is going to be difficult because you have so much stimulus going into the market, but you've dumped $7 trillion into the market and you've gotten us to 2,800. What does that mean going forward? Like, how much can you actually dump into the market before you have this resurgence? And it comes down to velocity of money, which is just the inability to get it from point A to point B and then having it cycling through the system. And the one thing that we haven't really touched on is the opening of Fed swap lines. And all that is a Fed swap line will look at a country like South Korea and say, okay, you have X amount of trillions of treasuries that you can post as collateral. We'll open up a direct swap line, which just means you'll be able to trade your won for dollar at a fixed rate, and you won't have to go into the spot market. So then you kind of minimize the cost, because instead of having South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, all of these guys competing to buy dollars on the spot market, driving prices up, you get them away and you kind of solidify, look, you can go here and not worry about it. The IMF is going to open up a $1 trillion US dollar swap line with countries that are deemed strong, but don't have the collateral to open up a direct swap line with the Fed. So this is another way to kind of get dollars into the market and to help prop up the global economy, not just our economy. The problem is now, exports. If you're exporting less, it means you're taking in less dollars. So you're leveraged to the gills. And to your point about leverage, that much leverage means that you can't last that long, because you have such high costs, you have such high rates. So you're having, Turkey and India have issued gold-backed bonds, which means that you don't trust your own economy, your own currency, and you don't trust the dollar, or is your dollar buyer gone? You've already had Indonesia, Thailand, Turkey defending their currencies. There's a significant amount of issues abroad, and the problem is if they default, which I think they will at some point, because the dollar bond will be too expensive to carry, all of a sudden you have all these dollars that you were hoarding to protect your currency and to feed your debt. Well, now I don't need that. And you can get a wave of dollars just getting unleashed into the world, which then gets slammed back into the US. And now you've spent how much time printing trillions of dollars into the market that you now immediately have to sop up. Well, how do you do that? Well, you have to issue everything that you purchased. Now, if you're issuing it at are you going to buy it back for what you sold it to them for? Probably not. And then the question is, what does the markdown look like? Then this is how it unwinds. The problem in terms of what Elliott is saying, that takes a lot longer. That is a process that has to build on itself. And if we really get some sort of normalcy by June, I have a hard time seeing us getting that low. I do think we will retest the lows we've achieved. I think that you're going to get a lot of concerns after these bank earnings, and I think a lot of these earnings that are coming out. But the earnings, the question is how far past are investors going to look? And are you really going to look to 2022 at this point? I'm going to say no.
Yeah, I agree. So let's talk about, since we last chatted, you've launched a podcast, and obviously film, because when we got faces like this, you want these faces out.
Absolutely.
Everywhere.
That's what it is.
So,
even if you can't get a haircut,
I know.
you have to start hiding.
I mean, if I take my this is what's going on.
Oh yeah, the mop.
Last time I saw a barber, I mean, it's going to cost me 3x. I look like I could live in the woods if I was allowed to go to the woods.
It's good. Yep.
So talk to the listeners about your podcast.
So the podcast right now is really focused on oil and gas. The global supply chain in terms of infrastructure, energy, chemicals, refining, and really the frac spread count. Really taking what's happening globally, my background in FX rates and commodities, and kind of merging that. And then we one of our biggest benefits of that is the frac spread count. So really looking at what is happening in the U.S. and how is that going to impact the energy space over the longer term as you have activity ramping down, and what does that mean for equipment, jobs, production, and where we sit in terms of the U.S. U.S. dominance, if you will, on the world energy stage. So
let's talk about the frac spread, because it dropped below 200 last week. It was at like sort of 350, a little higher than 350, kind of October, November, as people were like rushing to the end of the year. I think supply, and you and I have talked about this a lot, I think that practically supply had rolled over and the U.S. was in decline. But now, I mean, Katie barred the doors, because capital, even when companies are saying we're going to spend 50% of what we said, they've already spent 25 to 30% in Q1.
Absolutely.
So it basically means come May 1st, there's going to be nothing. Where does the frac spread bottom out, in your opinion?
It's funny. I think it's gonna be a race to 100 over April, and I think you're gonna get, to as low as 40 or 50 as we head into June. And it's just because I think tank tops are real, and I know that there's a view of, well, tank tops have never happened before. Well, it's like, well, there's a first time for everything. Mm-hmm. And when you look at Enterprise is now asked to reverse one of the pipes to be able to go from Cushing up to, from the coast up to Cushing, you have to think about, well, where is the demand for our oil? And the demand for our oil is limited in the U.S. already due to gasoline tank tops. And distillate is the only thing that has some wiggle room. The problem is you're just going to get a hindrance in terms of where U.S. crude can get off the coast. So you're going to have to shut down aggressively. So first you stop completions. And once you stop completions and you start shut-ins, if guys are shutting in producing wells, can you really argue completing a new one? No. So I think you're going to get a quick move to 100. The pace is going to slow a bit in terms of from 100 to 40, but I think we could see 40 to 50 spreads throughout the United States at this point. So
that's very similar to my number, and I have us bottoming at 200 horizontal rigs. And I think that you and I are probably out there in terms of like other more, I'm going to say more mainstream analysts. And by that, I mean people who are more afraid for their jobs by saying the truth than we are. Yeah. But I mean, that is so impactful to jobs. I mean, if you drop 80% of the frac spreads, and like, do you think, I mean, Trump obviously with the whole OPEC, and you and I would both say, like, they had to shut in. So he sort of got in front of a train that was stopping anyway. Yep. It was never going to be enough. So he's trying to cater to the Republican base. But if he truly wants to make energy have any hope, I mean, refineries are going to be shut down. Fracs are going to be stopped. Drilling is going to be stopped. The industry is going to come to a total stop. The only thing the feds can do is guarantee debt at this point. And I read on Bloomberg, they're talking about buying storage from wells somehow.
Yeah, so they're gonna pay people not to produce. Something similar to what they did with the farmers back in the 30s. That still happens, where they pay you not to farm on specific land. And the problem with what's happening right now, and you touched on it with debt. There's too much debt on the sheets to really make any of this work. You need a healthy company that can actually make money on the other side of this. Apparently, somewhere along the lines, we decided Chapter 11 was a poor function, And I think the reason why people are now so scared of Chapter 11 is the bondholders. You have to think about, well, who are the bondholders? Who were the people that were chasing yields that didn't make sense for the risk you were taking? And the answer is pension funds. So now you have a situation where realistically that pension fund should take a haircut of 30 to 60% based on how they invested their capital. Right. The problem is then what does that look like on the other side? So you can say, well, Chapter 11, you equitize the debt. So you give up some of your debt, you get some equity in return, and you have the strongest survive. And all of a sudden, things you can make money if the equity survives over the next couple of years. Things start to normalize, and you don't have these grotesque executives taking stupid salaries and leveraging their business to the gills again. You're going to have to see this normalcy. The problem is, and this comes back to the Fed had a choice. They either raised rates back in over the last, let's call it 4 years, to say, okay, guys, pension funds need 4% return to normalize their base. I'm going to get the Fed funds rate to 3.5%, and it's up to you to make that additional 50 basis points. Instead, they said, yeah, we're not going to do that. So good luck trying to make up that money. So now the pension funds were like, okay, we can either increase our risk tolerance or cut our constituents and tell them, hey, guys, we had promised you 4%. It's probably closer to 2%. So you're going to have to change the way you live. Yeah. And no one did any of that. So now we're sitting in a situation where the Fed didn't raise rates when they should have to help protect and solidify and make people make good decisions with the rates they were going to pay. And at the same time, the pension funds didn't cut their constituents and say, hey, live on 2%. Because we need to maintain a certain amount of integrity in what we invest in. And now you're like, all right, well, I have to make somebody pay. And the answer right now is the taxpayer. Right. The taxpayer is going to pay. And that's not fair either, because does that mean I get to own some of Pioneer's acreage? Sure. Okay. I want to control it then. I'll take that piece. Like we could become the private equity fund of the United States. And we'll just buy up acreage, and 2 years from now, we'll sell it or we'll start producing it, and we'll make a lot of money.
Well, I mean, and you touched exactly on the point, which will bring us full circle. But the pensions, if you go to Chapter 11, they have to take a mark on their bond investment, presumably, which then shows that the pensions that are paying teachers their pensions and firemen and policemen and everyone, they then have to tell people that you're going to get a lot less money in the pension that we thought you had. And so like the stimulus package, everyone was super excited to pass the $2.3 trillion and now 3.4 when this gets passed. But they didn't say, and oh, by the way, Social Security, which is $1 trillion a year, benefits are cut and the age is now 75. And oh, by the way, Medicare is $1 trillion expense. That's now cut in half. And the co-pays are now $5,000 because no one has wanted to have the real conversation that there is a fundamental structural problem with the financial obligations of our country and of our pensions.
And it was all created by these artificially low rates. So when you have artificially low rates, you go down the risk metric. At the lowest, people were giving Nigeria debt at 6%. Is Nigeria really that safe? You're going to give them debt at 6%? Now what are you going to give them debt at? And the answer is none. There's no bid. There's nothing. So that's where I think this really unhinges, and you start to see that 1600 really comes into play. Is when does a sovereign nation have a failed auction? And I look at a failed auction as you ask for 100 billion and you got 70, or you ask for 100 billion at, let's call it 150 basis points. And somebody said, no, not 150. It's 750. Take it or leave it. And that's when people are going to be like, oh, the game is over. Like the piggy bank is now run dry. People are wising up to this, and you're going to get this huge strain. And that's when the question becomes down to austerity, because, we came into this year with a deficit on the U.S. budget. Not talking global, the U.S. but your budget deficit just for this specific year, this fiscal year, we had a deficit of 1.4 trillion.
Yeah.
So we already had to borrow 1.4 trillion just to close the gap. Then we did 2.4 trillion of stimulus, which means that has to be borrowed. And it probably has to be borrowed by more because, as we've talked about, all these companies hurting, that's tax revenue going away. So the deficit just widened, plus we issued 2.4 trillion. Now we're talking about another trillion. Who's the lender? Who's the buyer of last resort? Who wants the treasuries? And then the answer is going to be, well, the Fed will. It's like, okay, the Fed will buy all the treasuries. It's like, okay, well, who wants dollars? You always need to have a buyer of last resort. And if people are saying, you know what, I don't want dollars. I don't trust the US dollar anymore.
Yeah.
Or I have less trust in it, so I don't want it. Then all of a sudden, like you talked about with Medicare, $1 trillion bill. Sorry, guys, I don't have $1 trillion. It's got to be 500 billion. Social Security. Sorry, guys, like I've borrowed from the future too often. It's now 250 billion. And then you start getting the shrinking aspect because you're going to have to live within your means, and we haven't been able to do that since we came off the gold standard.
But so people, and everyone says, well, we've seen these blips before and we always come out the other side stronger. And to me, again, this is my natural cynical guy, cynicism. It just doesn't feel the same as ever before.
Yeah.
And so what it feels like is Great Depression. It feels like massive devaluation of currency. So you can't even protect currency by sitting in cash. Right. Even if you went short all these products, you end up with US dollars that are kind of not worth anything. And the entire economic system collapses. And then I don't, so that, and the problem is I keep ending up back in that point. And everyone says, well, that's impossible, because if that happens, the world ends. And I'm like, but that's sort of what we're doing. If, back to our original point, we don't just let the virus run, because we don't have an infinite number of trillions of dollars to stop it.
Right. Well, and you have to think about, and this is why I always go back to December of 2019. To me, the recession had already started in Q4 of 19. There was already a recession. GDP was getting crushed around the world. You had PMIs going down, hand over fist. You had industrial capacity falling because people were already hurt by the strain of their debt. The leverage that they had consumed, and they were losing the ability to go out there and renegotiate and rolling that debt at the same rates. So you had a forest fire raging, and now you have COVID-19 just dropping jet fuel on that forest fire. And now the question is, like, to your point, we're out of control. And whenever you get out of control, you have to have a meeting of the minds. And I do think we're going to have another Bretton Woods meeting where we're going to sit down and say, okay, guys, we need to figure this out. And I don't know if that's, okay, we're going to keep the US dollar standard for trade because it's too onerous to replace it, but we're going to have to cut total debt by 30% across the board. So is it going to be something where France agrees that they lent to Germany or Germany lent to France and they're going to forgive 30%, and the US is going to say, look, we borrowed from you and we're going to only pay back 70%. Is there going to have to be a almost global reset to say we got ahead of ourselves, we acted foolishly, and we need to pull back? The question is, how does the consumer change? And I always go back to my grandparents who were, the product of the Great Depression. They kept money in their coffee cans till the day they died, and they didn't have to. It's just they were forced to. We really need to change the way we consume. Do you need the newest iPhone upgrade? Do you need the newest TV because it has a new little cool button, even though you don't know what that button does? Probably not. Like you may need to live within your means. Like if you can't afford that vacation this year, save up and go next year. Don't borrow $10,000 from the credit card at 18% rates to take that dream vacation. Just wait a minute. And then that's a big focus in terms of how things will shift over time. And I think there's going to be this meeting of how are we going to readjust? And I think readjusting is going to be key in terms of the debt load. And is it going to take a reset? I think it does. Because I don't see a way to really, like, when Indonesia goes bankrupt and defaults on all their US dollar denominated debt, who are you suing to get paid?
Right. Well, and I kind of, it's kind of funny. I read a Tom Clancy book many years ago. I think it was called Debt of Honor.
Yeah.
And the concept was the Japanese like bought all the US currency, and then they like created this event to like tank the market, and then they dumped all the currency they bought and like destroyed the US economy. And Jack Ryan, the best character ever created by any author in the history of ever, like said, no, we're just going to undo the last 4 days, and we're just going to pretend like they didn't exist. And I've been thinking about that since you and I talked in March, which is at some point you're going to have to pretend like April, May, and June didn't exist. Wipe out all rents, all interest, all everything, and just like cut them out, and just like nobody made any money, nobody spent any money, and just it all goes away. Because unless you do that, we're screwed.
And that's the problem. Like you had this rush to buy US dollar denominated debt, and you might say, well, why? Like, why would you do that? And it was if you were Indonesia or if you were Malaysia, not to just pick on them, but if you were those countries and you saw the dollar getting crushed because Bernanke was printing, the dollar looked cheap, people were looking for yield. Well, it's expensive to have an interest rate swap. And an interest rate swap is just you're swapping two different interest rates. So even though they're lending in their local, I'm really getting paid in dollars. That's complicated. That's expensive. So let's skip the middleman, and we'll just issue dollar denominated debt. Even though my economy is operated in my local currency, I'm still going to pay you in dollars. Well, with the dollar strong and guys buying dollars, that became expensive. So you're going to have to say, look, you're going to have to do something with all this debt. I mean, there's 15 trillion on the sheets. China has 37 trillion now of debt outstanding. I think we're up to 257 trillion of debt outstanding. And the consumer, and this is why I talk about 2019, we had delinquencies on cars and delinquencies on credit cards were at all-time highs in 2019. Well, I thought everything was fine. Like, I thought everyone was doing well. So now you had delinquencies already high in 19, and now you have people that have, to your point about Great Depression, I mean, we make unemployment during the Great Depression look like, everything's fine. Our unemployment is gonna top out well above where we were in the 30s. We're gonna have GDP growth globally at the lowest it's ever been, and it's, I think, at 0.3%, which I think is too high. I think it's easily negative, and that's just because the CCP and China are just a bunch of liars. And any number you take, you have to cut by, 6%. So if they say they're growing at 3%, it's really negative 3% in terms of the way you have to think about their structure. So it's just, you're going to have a significant slowdown. But at the same time, and this comes full circle in terms of pricing, like you talked about, where tech is, we need to let price discovery happen. We need to let guys to say, look, am I buying Apple at where is it? Apple is currently trading at, moved over.
Probably
so
280.
Apple's at 286 right now. So Apple's at 286. Am I buying at 286? No, but is it a bargain at 180? Sure. Is it a bargain at 150? Absolutely. Like, am I buying Amazon right now at
2400?
Yeah, no, but I'll buy it at 800. Is it going bankrupt? Absolutely not. It's a great company. It's going to survive, but you need to think about, let price discovery happen, because then you get sticky hands. Then you get guys that are going to own this again for the long haul. People, you look at the bailouts that have already rolled out with Delta and the other airlines. I mean, Delta, they issued a bailout when the stock was trading at 20. It's like, buddy, you bought back how much of your stock? Issue your stock. How many people think Delta is a great buy at $10? I would say, there's a chance, like, Delta, you need to fly. We're going to get back to normal at some point. The planes will go back in the air. I'll buy Delta at $8-10. So why not give people the opportunity to do that instead of stopping this realization, or let them go back into bankruptcy for the 15th time for most of these airlines.
Right.
And we need to send executives to jail. Like, the executives need to be held accountable for what they did. Everyone keeps telling me, oh, COVID-19 was a black swan event. Was 9/11 not a black swan event? Did everybody know 9/11 was happening and the airline industry was going to get crushed? No. So that you can have some crazy events. I'm not saying sit on a ton of cash, but be responsible with your balance sheet. It's okay to have $5 billion on your sheets. It's okay to not issue debt to buy back stock. Because when something like this happens and you need to issue debt, you're not at 5 times leverage, you're at 1.5 times leverage, and people will be like, you know what, that's a great balance sheet. I'm okay taking that risk.
Yeah, I mean there is going to be a change in capitalism, and I think the only counterpoint I make to everything you said, which I agree with functionally, don't use debt to buy back shares. There's a lot that could have changed. Because this was a government mandated shutdown for a virus, and you're not even allowed to fly if you wanted to, and you're not allowed to open a restaurant if you wanted to,
right.
There is some moral hazard about what the US government and the governments around the world have done. Mm-hmm. But that being said, hopefully y'all enjoyed this episode as much as I do. I love chatting with Mark. I think a lot of people forget how interconnected all of the market is. And that if anything, in the last 100 years, the market has become more interconnected and not less. And there's so much correlation, like the correlation between all the markets is so high, you can't have something happen in one place and not understand it in another. So hopefully from an economic standpoint, a global manufacturing, pricing, stock market, money, these episodes are good. I love them. I'm going to keep having Mark on the show to keep chatting about it. And so, Mark, love what you're doing. Love the podcast. I congratulate you for that. I always love your point of view, and I think it's super, super knowledgeable. You scare the hell out of me. I'm going to go start drinking now.
Well, it's good. Well, I appreciate it. I love the content. So thank you so much for having me on again.
Awesome. Well, you can always follow us at www.hottakeoftheday.com. Email me anytime. And for those of you who saw on LinkedIn, I posted my text. That is my real number. If you ever want to chat about something, you can call me. And if you're in crisis, I'm always going to take a call. I'm only an asshole on the air. I'm actually pretty nice elsewhere. So thanks. Until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day, and bye for now. Thank you, sir. That was awesome.
No, it was a pleasure. I appreciate the time.